So I should say my name is Thomas Doughton. I teach at the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester. And as Daniel Mandel just reminded me, to a certain extent, this is sort of like a reunion. Dan, I, Margaret, Ella, and Ruth all presented at the last conference, although I'm not presenting today. So it is as a reunion of sorts. So what I'd like to do is introduce people individually. And I want to begin with Margaret Newell, who's a recipient of an undergraduate degree from Brown and her doctorate from the University of Virginia. She is currently an associate professor of history at Ohio State University. She's the author of From Dependency to Independence, Economic Revolution in Colonial New England. Many of you may know that text. It was published in 1998 at Cornell. And Margaret has a forthcoming title, Race Frontiers, Indian Slavery in Colonial New England, which will be released by Cornell sometime soon. And, you know, she's the recipient of numerous grants, NEH, ACLS, MHS, AAS, Huntington, and is the author of several articles dealing with this topic. Today, Margaret will be presenting a paper entitled Race Relations, Indian Slavery in Colonial New England. So I want to have Margaret begin without further ado because we want to make certain that we have time for audience interaction at the conclusion of the three presentations.
Well, I think anyone who was at last evening's opening remarks by Ira Berlin, Professor Horton, and Joanne Mellish heard this message repeated several times that Indian slavery is an important part of any discussion about slavery in early New England. And the fact is that Indians constitute the majority of those persons enslaved in the Americas prior to 1700. And although we associate Indian slavery more with Latin America, with Spanish America, the fact is that even in North America, Indians constituted anything from a significant proportion to also the majority of those enslaved prior to 1700. And there's a flood of research going on right now, looking at colonial Louisiana, looking at French Canada, looking at Okay, sure. Sorry about that. Okay. I generally try to stand in front of the podium because I'm a little bit vertically challenged, so I find it works better for my students. But if we see all this new research coming out, looking at everything from the Pacific Northwest to the Southwest to the Mississippi Valley, New France, all of these European powers were engaged in enslaving Native Americans from the onset of colonization. And New England was no exception to this rule. I think it was also a theme of last night's remarks to a certain extent that there's a tendency to leave the North out of discussions about slavery, partly because of its abolitionist activities in the 19th century, but also because of the presupposition of many historians that because we didn't, outside of the Narragansett, Rhode Island, we don't see the large-scale plantation agriculture, because we see the New England economy as being an economy based on family farms, small business, family operation, that there was no need for slave labor. But the facts speak otherwise. And in fact, there was an interest in binding labor of all kinds in New England: white labor, Indian labor, and African labor. Indians were a local resource that New Englanders actively sought to bind into various types of bonded labor. Now, my research suggests that the Indian slavery went through several stages between the first contact between the English settlers and Native Americans in the early 1600s through the middle of the 18th century. In the 17th century, most Indians who found themselves enslaved were war captives. They were prisoners of war captured during the Pequot War in 1637, King Philip's War in 1675, 1676, and the wars on New England's northern frontier, areas around Maine, northern New Hampshire, southern Canada, that really immediately followed King Philip's War and continued in the 1680s and 1690s. But in addition to enslaving male combatants, in other words, warriors, or people they actually encountered in military activities, New Englanders also enslaved non-combatant women and children surrounding these conflicts. So refugees and people who were, any Native Americans could find themselves subject to capture and enslavement under these same sorts of just war arguments during these confusing wartime conditions. And this also applied even to Christian Indians, or Indians who were technically living under the protection of guardians of the justice of the peace, living in reservations set aside by the New England colonies in Massachusetts and elsewhere. Even these folks could find themselves seized, sold abroad, or bound into servitude within New England. So in the 17th century, we see this enslavement of war captives as how, I'm estimating about 1,300 Native Americans found themselves sentenced to various terms of servitude, whether it be a finite block or perpetual slavery. But beginning in the late 17th century, these conditions of these methods of enslavement started to shift. And King Philip's War is really a major turning point for the shift that I found. Now, in the 17th century, in addition to Native Americans who found themselves enslaved during wartime, very few were also enslaved for other reasons. Were enslaved by the court, sentenced to slavery for a variety of infractions, debt, thefts, or other sorts of occasionally violent crime, or in the case of one individual, even insolent carriage, sort of threatening carriages, repeat offenses. A few scattered individuals found themselves sentenced to slavery, exported out of the colonies, or sentenced to servitude within the colonies. But these were very unusual incidents involving Native Americans. And I have to also say that white people found themselves enslaved or sentenced to servitude under some of the same conditions in the 17th century. We know actually that during the English Civil War, Scots Presbyterians were enslaved. People captured during the English Civil War were sentenced to something called slavery. Some of these Scots actually even found themselves shipped to Massachusetts, where they worked in sawdust ironworks and other areas. We also see other examples of servants whites being sentenced to servitude in the 17th century and the early 18th century. But I'd argue that the status of these whites who were sentenced to slavery or servitude is very different from that experienced by Native Americans, these war captives or these non-combatant women and children who were swept up into slavery, and also very different from even these Native Americans who were sentenced to servitude because of these various by the courts due to these criminal penalties. First of all, slavery in the 17th century was an evolving institution. Slavery did not necessarily carry all of the connotations of chattel slavery, of heritability, right, that your children would automatically be enslaved after you, that it would be a lifelong sentence. We have to think in the 17th century, in all of these colonial contexts, slavery was not necessarily the institution that we begin to see defined in the late 17th century, the 18th century, and the 19th century. So it's a term in flux. Sometimes the terms slave and servant are used interchangeably. Sometimes people are referred to as slaves are freed after set terms during the 17th century. And in the case of these whites who are sentenced to slavery for infractions, for treason, who are captives in a just war, it tended to be a finite term. So it might be a term of 7 years as a slave. In other words, the term slavery, when it was applied to whites, was implied a temporary status as opposed to a permanent condition. Whereas for Native Americans who are caught up in this system, their situation is much more, it's very different. Slavery, when Native Americans are enslaved or taken as servants or called servants, called slaves, their terms often are technically finite in the beginning, but they're not freed after the terms the way they're supposed to be. I find that a lot of these Native American servants get trapped into a kind of permanent situation. They're not freed after set term. They don't sort of gain the rights and privileges that whites who are freed after set term do. And by the 18th century, the practice of sentencing whites to servitude for criminal offenses is really declining, even as I find the practice of enslaving Indians or sentencing Indians to terms of servitude is really on the increase. So I mentioned that there's another important shift that occurs involving Indian slavery in the late 17th century. And that is, after King Philip's War, which is so devastating for Native Americans. We all know the devastating impact it has on Native American population, on Native American land holdings. And King Philip's War essentially places the Native Americans of southern New England under the jurisdiction of the southern New England governments of Massachusetts, Connecticut, Plymouth, which will soon become part of Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. But this event had a sort of double-edged effect for Native Americans. On the one hand, King Philip's War really represented the high point of enslavement during wartime for Native Americans. So many Native Americans find themselves enslaved during King Philip's War and its aftermath. But the very volume of Indians who become enslaved during this conflict, and the fact that their loss in the war, that their defeat in the war, makes them subjects of the New England governments, creates an interesting set of new legal conditions. And now New England Indians are subjects of New England governments, and they have the rights of subjects, the right to petition, the right to use the courts, and many Native Americans started challenging their enslavement during King Philip's War. So we see petitions, we see tribal leaders coming forward, Christian Indians protesting their captured enslavement, and even a discussion about whether the colony had a right to enslave non-combatant women and children. Now, some of these petitions are actually successful. The colony of Massachusetts sent agents to the Azores Islands to repatriate some New England Indians who had been sent there, who had been enslaved and then exported to the Azores Islands. So some Indians are actually successful in gaining their freedom through this petition activity. King Philip's War had an even more profound effect in the long term. Beginning in the 1670s and continuing through the 1730s, the New England governments now viewed these Native Americans as subjects, as wards to a certain extent. It has a series of laws intended to protect Native Americans from enslavement, essentially outlawing outright enslavement of Native Americans. Now, limiting enslavement didn't mean that all types of Indian servitude were out of bounds. There were often these laws outlawing enslavement were accompanied by laws which encouraged local authorities to place Indian children as apprentices or as servants in white households until they reached an age of maturity. And it did not prevent various sorts of civil and criminal court decisions which placed Indians in situations of servitude. So we see a spate of legislation designed to protect Indians from outright enslavement, but those interested in binding Indian labor merely turned to the courts as a new mechanism for achieving those goals. So beginning in the 1680s, I see a rapid increase in court decisions in sentencing Native Americans to terms of servitude or to outright slavery for debt, for theft, or for various sorts of criminal infractions. So, for example, in a single year in Martha's Vineyard, 13 Native Americans in the 1680s are sentenced to various terms of servitude. And in fact, Martha's Vineyard and other sites, Plymouth, other colonies had what they called a public bandu. They, in other words, had regular public auctions of Indians who had been sentenced by the courts to terms of servitude. Another set of legislation that facilitated these changes or the shift towards what I call judicial enslavement, the enslavement of people by the courts individually through these variety of court decisions, were new laws that applied to theft and to debt, which allowed victims of theft to sue the thief for triple damages. And in some cases, for Native Americans in particular, Plymouth had a special law that said you could get quadruple damages from Native American defendants. So this meant if one was convicted of theft, a Native American was convicted of theft, he or she had not only make restitution, but pay triple damages on whatever he or she had stolen. And these ended up being enormous sums. So essentially then the individual would be auctioned off to pay this debt plus court costs plus other charges and fees that were added to the total. And under these sorts of circumstances, terms could range anywhere from 2 to 35 years. And once enmeshed in these sorts of situations, once sentenced to servitude under these kinds of conditions of debt or theft, Native Americans in many cases found their terms extended. In other words, if they were then convicted of another offense, master could sue them. New laws also allowed masters to sue their own servants, essentially. Brought before court again, if you attempted to run away, brought before court again, have additional years tacked on to your indenture. Sure.
Can you speak into the microphone?
Sure. Had additional years tacked onto their indentures. So that even though this status, even though there's officially laws outlawing slavery, even though these Indians are being sentenced to servitude, many of them could find themselves being servants for life. Now, this is still different from slavery as we're seeing it becoming in the 18th century. There's still these issues of was the status of slavery heritable? In other words, what's happening to the children of Indians who are being held in servitude? And this is a sort of thorny question. This is a question I've been finding a difficult time answering in my research, and it's something that two of our other paper givers, Ruth Herndon and Ella Sekoto, are going to be speaking to. In some cases, it seems like these Native Americans are serving as servants for life or people with set terms. But I found a number of situations, particularly women, but men too, who once they fall into this the situation of servitude, once either by the courts or captives in King Philip's War, who are supposed to be servants for a finite period of time, once they're in the situation of servitude, that there's a slippage in their status without any decree, without a legal construction defining this transition. Many of these people just start to be considered slaves, and unless they're in a position to challenge this status that's now been essentially foisted on them, or a kind of de facto status, then that's what they are. And as examples of this, I see are the people that actually try to fight this situation. An Indian man named James, who had, as a child, had been taken during King Philip's War, had been sentenced to what was supposed to be a finite term of servitude. His mistress, when her husband died, his mistress remarried. James ends up in Pennsylvania, and 18 years later is suing for his freedom because he's being identified as a slave in Pennsylvania. He was supposed to be freed after a 7-year term. He should have been free by 1783. He's still a slave in Pennsylvania. And James is challenging the situation, petitioning about the situation. I think there's many other Native Americans who find themselves stuck in this slippery condition. Another woman who is from the Charlestown Reservation in Narragansett, Rhode Island, is listed in the court records as Sarah Mulatto. Well, Sarah sued for her freedom on the basis that her master had sold her to a man named Edward Robertson in New London as a slave, and she challenged the fact that she was subject to slave status. Now, the courts in the end found that Sarah was indeed not a slave, that she was part Indian. She was able to establish that her mother was a Narragansett Indian, had been a Narragansett Indian, living in Charlestown. Because she was able to establish that identity and that connection, the courts freed her and declared this contract of sale void, and also declared that her master had sort of been illegally holding her as a slave. Now, in the case of Sarah, one of the interesting things about that particular case is that her whole basis or case for freedom rested on her race. It would have been okay to enslave her and sell her into New London if she had indeed been a mulatto, a mixed-race person, part black person. Because she was able to establish her Indian identity, and there were laws against the enslavement of Indians, she was able to challenge the situation. But for many other Native Americans held in servitude, their position became much more difficult, much more ambiguous. What I find is in the 18th century, many Native Americans and people of mixed race who identify as Native American find themselves defined by courts, by civil society in New England as black or part black, and therefore subject to enslavement. So there's a lot of slippage in official records, and you often see this in the same court case. The same individual will be referred to in several ways with several different racial phenotypes. And Joanne Mellish gave a very interesting presentation last evening where she talked about the variety of terms that were out there to describe people of color, and that describe various, black, Negro, colored, African, Indian, Musti, mulatto, and she talked about the ways in which these were vernaculars and ways in which there were shifts over time in how this language was used, how different people could have the same title applied to them, and so on and so forth. And what's significant, I think, about the shift in the early 18th century, where I'm looking at it, between 1700 and 1750, is that these terms really mattered because, again, if you were Native American, you couldn't be enslaved officially. But if you were categorized as black or as part black, you could be enslaved. So that this battle over categorization, how is one going to be identified racially, becomes very important in New England. Now, in addition, other legislation affected the status of Indian slaves and servants between the 1690s and the 1730s in New England. And I argued that what we see the New England colonies doing is creating a race frontier of sorts, passing the same kinds of black codes or legislation that applies to people of color that we see being passed in other slave societies in Virginia, South Carolina, Latin America, and elsewhere. Laws that applied to Africans and Indians, not to whites. So in other words, Indian slaves and servants were being lumped together with African slaves and servants for the purposes of the special legislation. One law basically declared that Indian slaves and servants and African slaves and servants were no longer to be rated as people for a poll tax. In other words, if you were a householder, you paid your yearly taxes, you paid a tax on the polls, on the heads of everyone in your household, including your servants. After 1696, Indian servants and slaves, as well as Africans, were no longer considered people for purposes of the poll tax. They were literally to be rated with horses and hogs. That's the language of this particular law. So already, Indian servants and slaves are being lumped together with African slaves, African servants, as people with a different status of white servants in a particular household. Other laws forbade, controlled assembly. In other words, after-hours get-togethers of people of color. There were curfews. There were special penalties for criminal infractions. Even special courts, non-jury courts that didn't have juries for Indians and Africans who were convicted of theft or other sorts of infractions. So in other words, a whole separate legal code that applied to people of color created in New England between the 1690s and the 1730s. And again, these sorts of laws also further marginalized the status of Indian servants. So in other words, even people who were technically servants, technically not slaves, are being included in this legislation that essentially aimed at creating a slave system, limiting their freedoms, limiting their access to the courts, and anti-miscegenation laws were part of this. So what we see, in a sense, is almost a two-tier system being created in which free Indians who lived at or near tribal lands or had had connections to a tribe have certain rights and privileges, even though they're subject to these New England governments. They have access to land. They can't officially be enslaved. They have access to courts. Whereas these Indian servants and slaves are despite their identity as Indians, were being pushed into another and more distinct racial category. Now, what are the implications of all these shifts for Native Americans and for whites and for Africans? One of the interesting things, and I think Dan Mandel is going to talk about this a little bit in this paper, is that this means that Indians and Africans who are servants and slaves and households are spending a fair amount of time together. So there's actually a lot of intercultural exchange, relationships formed between blacks and Indians and under conditions of servitude. But servitude and enslavement had a devastating impact on Native American culture in the region, as you can well believe. Children were forcibly apprenticed, in other words, taken out of their homes, raised in Christian families. Think of the impact this must have had on language acquisition, on the ability to maintain kin ties, on the ability to sort of maintain the Native American culture. Now, there's lots of evidence, though, that Native Americans under servitude did what they could to maintain ties with kin, to try to continue engaging in various sorts of cultural activities, evidence about practice of religion, about funeral rites. But even these activities also came under some regulation by the courts in the 18th century, 1720s and 1730s. Now, we also have to think about what kind of impact the presence of all these Native American workers had, not just on Native Americans, but on the white society they're part of. These people are living in white households. They're taking care of children of the people that own them or own their labor. They're working in the fields. They're working alongside whites as whalemen. They're serving in the provincial forces. They're part of the fabric of New England life and living in close proximity with white families in all aspects of the economy in rural and urban areas. So I think we've really come to really appreciate the extent to which this proximity to Native Americans and what kind of impact Native American culture might have had on white society in New England. There's a lot of evidence of whites attending Native American funerals or so-called Indian dances, social relationships, especially amongst people of the same class, especially white servants, poor white farmers. There's a fair amount of social contacts across racial lines, despite the efforts of authorities to create this sort of race frontier separating white society from that of people of color. So these cultural, effects, I think, are part of the interesting, one of the interesting parts of this particular story. But one other sort of being given the high sign to sort of wrap things up. This is speaking to the mic. To wrap things up a little bit too. But I think finally, what the case of Native Americans in New England has to say to us, or can contribute, is the complexity of slavery as an institution and as an evolving institution. An institution that meant different things at different times and different things in different regions, even within a region as small as New England. That the term slave was not a clear-cut term in the 17th century. It was becoming more clear-cut in the 18th century, due in part to legislation, but this still doesn't necessarily tell us how people, about the experience of an individual who's being termed a slave. It's still difficult to figure out what's happening to the second and third generations of Native Americans who had been held, the children of these people held under servitude, captured in King Philip's War. What happens to them? I have some evidence that mothers and children being sold together, which indicates to me that these children were taking on the status of their parents, were going to be considered slaves, were going to be held as slaves for life. Because of the high death rates and mortality that many Native Americans experienced, a sentence of servitude of 20, 30 years was a life sentence, more or less. Because of high mortality amongst Native Americans, there are a lot of orphan children, there are a lot of single women with children who again find themselves sentenced to servitude, and I think especially these women and children are the ones who are most vulnerable to seeing their status shift from servant to slave over time. But I think our other paper givers today are going to be giving us a little bit more information about relations between Africans and Indians in slavery, and also about what happens to Indian servants over the long term. And with that, I'll end my presentation.
Thank you, Margaret. Our next presentation is going to be Ruth Herndon and Ella Sikata. We're going to talk about one of the most extraordinary indentures in New England history. A person, Orson, who basically is indentured for 90 years, and he is a Native American who is memorialized in the town histories as a son of Africa, an African prince, that cliche. So there are a lot of issues raised there. But in any event, our two presenters are Ruth Herndon and Ella Sikata. Ruth Herndon, who has her advanced degree from American and an undergraduate degree from Houston, is an associate professor at the University of Toledo in Ohio. Her most recent publication is Unwelcomed Americans, which isn't on the list here. And Ruth has published a lot of articles, and she and Ella have been actively pursuing this collaboration, looking at European sources and Narragansett Indian tradition. Now, Ella Wilcox Sikata is an elder of the Narragansett tribe from Charleston, Rhode Island. She's long been trained to maintain the knowledge of her people's history, culture, and language. She's served as a medicine woman, ethnohistorian, genealogist for the Narragansett tribe, and as she corrected me yesterday, a longtime member of the tribal council. And Ella holds an honorary doctorate. So without further ado, Ruth and Ella, you have the floor.
I will read a very distilled 15-minute version of our paper. Then Ella will speak for a few minutes about Native communities in southern New England, about enslavement of Native people, and about Orson's life as revealed through Narragansett oral tradition. To illustrate the nature of indentured servitude and show how it functioned as a substitute for slavery of Native people in 18th century New England, we present the case of Orson, a young Indian man bound in servitude in 1764 for 70 years to English colonist Elias Thompson. In New England history, Orson's story spans the time from the devastation of King Philip's War, 1675 and 6, when thousands of Narragansett were killed or enslaved, to illegal detribalization of the Narragansett people by the state of Rhode Island in 1880. Orson's story fits within two overlapping contexts: colonial conquest and oppression of Native people by English colonists, and the Narragansett people's resistance, dispersion, and survival in the face of English colonization. Orson's story is told primarily in two documents. the indenture which he marked when he entered his long bondage in 1764, and a 15-stanza laudatory poem written about him in 1878, a generation after his death, by a local minister. The contract gave Thompson rights to Orson's valuable labor for a lifetime. The contract presented Orson as needing oversight and care. The poem reconstructed Orson as African, exiled from his homeland and heroically freed from bondage by his New England masters. We invite your scrutiny of these documents. I've passed out copies. If we ran short, I hope you'll share with your neighbor. The unusual 70-year contract highlights the unclear boundary between indentured servitude and slavery. What kind of unfreedom was this? The contract gave Orson liberty to attend church, marry, have children, and even choose another master. But the centerpiece of the contract was Orson's labor. In return for a man's daily labor for as long as he was physically able, Orson was to receive all the necessities of life: lodging, meals, clothing, medical care, plus annual pay of 100 pounds Rhode Island old tenor. I'll come back to that in a minute. After he was too old to work regularly, he would still receive the necessities of life, but no pay. The contract raises an interesting question about the relationship between Orson and Elias Thompson. Orson was between 21 and 24 years old when he marked this indenture. This was the customary age at which a native boy completed his childhood apprenticeship. He was about the same age as Elias Thompson's oldest son. Orson's father was not identified in the indenture or in the other town records, but his mother was, Old Hitty, an Indian woman who had been a servant to Elias's father, Isaac. Hitty apparently became part of Elias's household after Isaac died. Her son grew up as an apprentice, cared for by his mother, but technically bound to his mother's master. When Orson reached adulthood, he agreed to this lifelong indenture. Were Elias and Orson father and son? Elias Thompson inherited land and servants from his father. The land was Narragansett land. The land on which Orson and other Indian servants and slaves labored for the Thompson family had been acquired originally by 5 English colonists in 1660 through agreement with a native sachem named Sasoa. Elias Thompson represented the most exploitative colonial practices, appropriating land from native people, controlling the labor of native people. I want to look at a couple key features of the indenture. Orson was identified by first name only, as was his mother. It was common in American slavery for masters to drop the family names of those they enslaved. It was also common for English colonists to eliminate the family names of native people in the records, so that Fleetfoot of the Fox clan became Fleetfoot, for example, a form of documentary genocide that effectively terminated the existence of the clan in record. As was customary in the English records of native enslaved people, Orson was identified by race, a mustee fellow. Record keepers in 18th century Rhode Island used the term mustee to signify native ancestry, but in a limiting way, to deny full native ancestry and to indicate a non-native parent. In this case, we conclude that Orson did indeed have a non-native parent, Elias Thompson. Orson was son to mustee woman that is commonly called Old Hitty. Hitty had lived with and labored for Isaac Thompson's family. Orson would live and labor for Elias Thompson's family. Orson had come to his bondage through his mother, as was the case with most native children bound out to English masters in 18th century New England. This child inherited his mother's condition. According to the indenture, Orson agreed to the contract because he had been treated kindly by Elias Thompson's family as he grew up, and that he, Orson, was something weak in capacity. The implication is that Orson was likely to be taken advantage of, and that the Thompson family could be trusted to deal fairly with Orson. That is, pay him what his labor was worth and see that his material needs were provided. However, there is no corroborating evidence of a mental handicap. Nothing in the records suggests that Orson was mentally or physically handicapped in any way, nor does the heroic poem later written by Denison. Quite the opposite. Orson's contract suggests his great potential for labor, and Denison describes Orson as being rather Herculean in physical strength. Further, Orson appears to have managed his own income, since no town official was ever appointed to handle his money. And Denison presents Orson as intellectually capable of eloquent argument for his own freedom. Thus, we believe the phrase weak in capacity was employed to try to justify the enslavement of Orson. The indenture obligated Orson to do a man's daily labor as long as he was physically able. The annual pay he was to receive, 100 pounds Rhode Island old tenor, was the equivalent of a little over 4 pounds sterling, or more than a month's wages for a free, unskilled laborer at this time. In all our research, we have never come across any accounts of servants or slaves being paid so handsomely. The contract relied on Thompson's heirs to maintain the agreement. In 1782, when Elias Thompson died, his wife and son Thomas, co-executors of his estate, took on responsibility for Orson. But these heirs soon reported that the estate was bankrupt. They failed to pay back wages due to Orson, and they neglected to provide maintenance and clothing for him as the contract stipulated. The Westerly Town Council had to send official representatives to prod the family to fulfill their obligations, and the record does not indicate whether Orson eventually received all that was promised. Was Orson's lifetime servitude any different than the official slavery of others in the same household? This question becomes even sharper when we move the story forward to 1878, when Frederick Denison published a history of Westerly which included his own poem about Orson. Orson can be easily identified in the poem by his singular name and by suggestions of his unnamed master's status and wealth, a stalwart and noble slave belonging to one of the prominent families in the south part of the town. Some of this that I'm quoting comes from the book itself and not directly from the poem. There's quite a bit about Orson in the book. The particulars of the poem include these 3 key points. African origins. Orson is represented as born in Afric's palmy plains and brought to North America through the slave trade and wrapped in chains. He lived in New England as an exile. In this way, Denison disconnected Orson from his ancestral land and from his ancestors. Legendary labor. Denison wrote elsewhere in the book, "Tradition says of Orson that he walked to Lyme and returned," which would be 60 miles round trip from Westerly. "He walked to Lyme and returned on the same day, and on the day following pulled, bound, and shocked an acre of stout flax." The poem celebrates him as an oak and remarks on his stalwart limbs and routine labor over plow and spade. If Orson was indeed a Herculean laborer, then the indenture represents Elias Thompson's shrewd calculations of the economic value of a strong man's lifelong labor. Finally, Indian burial. In his history of Westerly, Denison asserts that Orson was interred in an Indian burial ground. This, more than anything else, is proof of Orson's native heritage. He maintained his identity as an Indian throughout his life. His family and community knew who he was and honored him by burying him with his ancestors. Who were Orson's native ancestors? Many thousands of Narragansett and other native prisoners of war and non-combatant refugees were enslaved by English colonists in the 1600s in the wake of devastating colonial wars against the native inhabitants of New England. In the early 1700s, official unease about the scale and intensity of this slavery prompted colonial legislation that outlawed outright slavery of native people of the region and opened the way for intensive enslavement of people brought from Africa, the West Indies, and the Carolina colonies. Nevertheless, English colonists continued to hold local native people of New England in conditions of unfreeness that closely resembled slavery, particularly indentured servitude, a time-specific bondage governed by contract. Indentured servitude enabled New England colonists to extract highly profitable labor from local native people without calling it slavery. We believe that Orson's mother, Hitty, had an attachment to the Sosoa Grant property and remained with that property through servitude to Isaac and then Elias Thompson. Hitty's servitude probably originated with her own mother being enslaved after King Philip's War, beginning a chain of bondage that carried on for generations. In 1878, when Frederick Denison wrote his History of Westerly, Rhode Island officials were about to declare the native Narragansett people extinct. In 1880, the state legislature claimed officially that there was no person of pure Indian blood in the Narragansett Indian tribe that dwelled within the state's borders. Having thus declared the Narragansett Indian people to exist no longer, the state took away all but 2 acres of the land that had been reserved for the tribe's exclusive use for nearly 2 centuries. No federal law ever removed the tribal status of the Narragansett people. Rhode Island's detribalization action in 1880 in fact violated the Federal Trade and Intercourse Act of 1790 and was later proven to be illegal. At the time, however, state officials believed their case to be persuasive and their actions beyond credible challenge. Denison's story poem about Orson supported this characterization of Indians as a vanished people. By depicting Orson as African, Denison carried on the genocidal work of declaring that real Native people had died out. In truth, Denison was surrounded by vital and productive Native communities, even if he did not acknowledge them. The condition of indentured servitude in which Orson lived and labored for 70 years so strongly resembled slavery that it prompts us to reconsider the distinctions between these two forms of unfreedom. If we focus on the unfree people in Orson's story, we see that slavery and indentured servitude were equally effective as methods of colonial exploitation. Thompsons filled the land once inhabited by Orson's ancestors. Many Orsons labored while many Thompsons became rich and powerful. Generations of Thompsons owned the land while generations of Orsons were denied their identity as the native inhabitants of the land. Colonial exploitation of Native people extended beyond appropriation of land and labor to erasure of Native people from the written record. In the Westerly documents, Orson was described not as Native, not even as Indian, but as Mustee, and then Black, and finally African in 1878. Frederick Denison was too conscientious to eliminate important evidence, so he included in his telling what must have seemed to him a strange fact in 1878. Although Denison understood Orson to be an African exile with no referent community at hand, this man was buried not among Thompsons in a family cemetery or with fellow worshipers in the Hill Church burial ground. Orson was a member of the Hill Church, but among Native people in an Indian burial ground. Thus, the man who was born Indian also died Indian, but his life story was remembered as that of an African slave. Until now. It is a very long, straight line to the truth, and it is our goal to reveal that line. Thank you.
Which means good afternoon, friends. My name is Ella Sikatow, and as a member of the Narragansett Indian tribe and a part of the Medicine family, it has been my responsibility since birth to remember and to relate the history of our peoples, in many cases family by family, and also to be able to coexist and to know about those people that surrounded us. The Narragansett people have been bombarded for the last 300 years by the inception of people who would change their lifestyle if permitted. However, there has always been a handful of people who have been determined to observe and to practice the traditional lives of our people of the past, and it continues even until the 21st century. There are several parts of today's delivery that need a little more clarity, and that the first I will talk about is the story of Orson. Although he was given permission to take a wife and to have a family, there is no mention of it anywhere in the records. In that way, we can assume that there were a family of Orson's making, and that they were given the liberties because of the woman that he very probably married. I don't like to use subjunctives, but in that case I have to, because of the people of the 20th century whom I knew as Thompsons, who lived in the vicinity of Westerly and across the state line into Pawcatuck. One of the things that we do have to remember in dealing with the state lines is that the Indian people did not make those state lines. They were made by other people. And surprisingly, Rhode Island was able to keep its postage stamp territory away from Massachusetts and Connecticut. How exactly it was achieved was through the politics of the day. In many, many cases, they are forgetting the territorial boundaries of the royal family of sachems of the Narragansett. which included a much, much larger area than the state of Rhode Island, in Connecticut, in Massachusetts, in the southeastern parts of Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. So that was indeed a very, very large territory that was necessary to discuss. One of the things about the records that were kept, even though many of them were false, and even though it was the intent and a form of genocide to deny the fact that Indians still existed, it came in handy when we were re-establishing some of the important information. I have been asked, and I have been told, that I should not reveal the oral history of our people. However, it is time that the oral history is known for the truths that exist and existed about our people, rather than to accept what was written by strangers who did not really understand what they were seeing, who could not explain what they were hearing, and who thought that it would never be questioned. However they wrote it down, the Indian people sold the land. Our people sold no land. You didn't sell your mother. Our people did rent land as long as people agreed to take care of the land and to respect the earth mother. That is one of the things that connect us with the story of Orson, and the fact that he was a relative of the chief Sosoa, who was on the east side of Westerly, and whose land was turned over to some of the colonists. And it is very, very important that one of the agreements in the exchange of that land was that those people who took over charge of the land would always protect the earth mother and to treat it with dignity. The worth of indenture, which is just another name for a form of slavery, had its benefits in a very limited way. It was actually a chance to educate the outsiders to the way of their lifestyle, and at home you still continued to practice your own form of traditional survival. When I was told and asked, what are you telling people things for? And I said, well, I'm tired of dealing with the things that are not even logical or real about our people of the past. I said, I am tired of people saying to me, well, how many gods do you worship, Ella? And I have to tell them, I and my people and my ancestors worshipped only one God. And they said, oh, well, I thought there was a God of the water and the fire and the wood and the stones. I said, that is the misunderstanding of the people who were listening and trying to interpret what my ancestors were saying. That there were the spirit given to all parts of the creation by the Creator, and that there is a difference between the spirits of something and the reality of the greatest important, I can't say person, because if I say person, I'm going to have to disagree with many people, and I will refer to God as a female. And so there is that part of it that I am tired of explaining. To deal with all of these stereotypes that have prevailed because of the difference of the social strata of the people. coming from Europe, the males were in charge of and owned everything, including the women and the children. Here we had a matriarchal society. There was equality with the females and the males. And therefore there was this change that was inflicted upon the people, which was greedily accepted by many of the male Indians who had lost the war. They had lost their ability to protect the land. And it was impossible for them to assume and to be on equal basis with the females. So therefore, they accepted the Euro-American way of doing, where the males were more important than the females. However, everyone knows that the communities of the coastal Algonquian people are still based on the female side of the family. And it has been a pleasure to talk, and I could talk for hours, but it is time that I gave the table up to somebody else.
Thank you. Thanks very much. We're going to move away from the table because we'll be in the way of the PowerPoint presentation here. The last presentation in this session is being offered by Daniel Mandel, who is an assistant professor of history at Truman State University in Missouri. A lot of you know Dan's work, particularly Behind the Frontier, Indians in 18th Century Eastern Massachusetts, which was published in 1996, the University of Nebraska. Many of you also know Dan's article, Shifting Boundaries of Race and Ethnicity, Indians and Blacks in Southern New England, 1750 to 1880, which was published in the Journal of American History in 1998. And Dan is currently working on a book on Indians in Southern New England, 1780 to 1880. And today Dan's going to be offering a presentation entitled Freedom and Conflict Over Class, Gender, and Identity, the Evolving Relationship Between Indians and Blacks in Southern New England, 1750 to 1870.
During the 18th century, many individuals of African and of Native ancestry in southern New England formed and forged social and family relationships across ethnic lines. They worked as servants, as slaves, and as free laborers, sometimes in rural villages, sometimes even in the same household, often in port towns alongside each other. By the 1740s, annual Negro election festivals brought together Indians as well as Africans and many others in port towns and rural areas. Some African Americans who fled slavery found refuge in Indian communities, and a growing number of Indians and African descendants found enough commonality to readily form couples and create families. Indians and blacks were brought together by their shared legal and social status, created and reinforced by Anglo-American racial prejudices. Provinces and towns required blacks and Indians, whether freemen, slaves, or servants, to carry a certificate from their masters when out at night. And there's a text from the 1703 Rhode Island law. There were similar laws passed by Boston, town of Boston, in 1730s, 1740s, and by other provinces and towns as well. In 1706, Massachusetts banned marriages between whites and blacks, and in 1786 added Indians. Just as slavery ended, Rhode Island passed a similar measure about the same time. It appears for the first time that I could find it in January 1798 public laws. While African Americans may have been more deeply ensnared in permanent slavery, but as our other presenters have already told you, a very high percentage of Indians in the region, perhaps even a majority, were forced into servitude for many years, if not for their entire lives. The growing number of exogamous marriages, that is, marriages with outsiders, were also shaped by complementary demographic imbalances. And while censuses are suspect, the figures that we do have from southern New England between 1765 and 1774 show about 60% more Indian women than men, and those of slaves or blacks show the reverse. Many New England villages held only a few blacks and Indians, and even in the region's emerging cities, many mixed couples formed. Within New England lay a micro-world of Indian communities that had survived King Philip's War. And here you can see just 6 of the largest ones. I mean no disrespect to those that I did not put on this table, but they generally ranged in size from 100 to 4,000 acres, with anywhere from a few families to about 350 people. And again, those figures tended to vary over seasons as well as over years. Natives in the region operated their reservations in ways that reflected colonial innovations and Aboriginal traditions. Individuals, including women, and that's very important, could lay claim to and enclose land for crops and pass it to their children, although the lands of those who lacked heirs reverted to the community. Pastures and woodlands continued to be managed in common and assigned to households on a yearly basis, and any resident could cut needed firewood and building timber from the commons, hunt game or fish in the reserves, rivers, and ponds. By the way, these were, in the 19th century, Indian reservations were considered to be really the only places where you could still hunt, and some of the best fishing grounds in eastern New England. The reserve represented community, culture, and a sacred past. These traditions were, ironically, upheld by laws that barred the sale of Indian lands to outsiders and by guardians appointed by the legislature. African Americans who married into these communities benefited from access to their spouses' kinship networks, the tribe's land and resources, and freedom for their children. Some even had freedom purchased for them by their wives. Now, initially, Indians seemed to lack the racial prejudice of Anglo-Americans and viewed marriage with outsiders, regardless of skin color, as a way to gain new knowledge and power. But that seemed to change in the last quarter of the 18th century, apparently driven by existing tribal conflicts over power and land. This is particularly evident among the Mohegans. In May 1773, a faction of the tribe that had opposed the traditional sachem, the Uncas family, that faction led by Samson Occum, a famous minister, agreed that the children of those who had married Negroes would have no tribal rights. And in response, their opponents denounced this agreement and tried to depict Occum and his supporters as foreigners and blacks. Those are the terms from their petition. This and other battles were also clearly shaped by Anglo-American racism, as leaders struggled to distinguish themselves and their people by employing, without any sense of irony, the language of race. When Occum and his allies established the pan-tribal community of Brothertown in the Oneida Territory, they barred Negroes and banned marriages with, quote, persons of Negro blood. Since most exogamous marriages involved Indian women and foreign men, gender became intermingled with race and power in these emerging conflicts. Brothertown's founders limited the rights of women as well as blacks. Narragansett men developed a very bitter feeling against blacks when a noticeable number of the tribe's women married African American men. And supposedly at their behest, the state, Rhode Island, in 1792, limited tribal citizenship, including the right to vote in tribal elections, to men with the Narragansett mother or father, but not those with Negro mothers. And I should note that Narragansetts themselves said later on in the 1880s that this law was passed because slave owners in the state of Rhode Island wanted to maintain a younger group of black slaves. It was not, in fact, the tribe's wish that this be done. While such marriages were rare on Martha's Vineyard before 1790, by the turn of the century, men from Chappaquiddick and Christiantown were very concerned, as their white guardian later remembered, and this is from his petition, his letter, about their females marrying Negroes whom they did not wish to have any rights to their land. And he told the General Court that some from Christiantown had filed lawsuits between 1805 and 1813 to stop such marriages. I haven't actually been able to find records of such lawsuits. Now, after 1800, the rising tide of freedom created a gap between Indian and African American cultures and gave rise to two distinct, though connected, groups. Perhaps the most noteworthy characteristic of the emerging free black community was its urban environment. Most African Americans in the region already lived in port towns, but with emancipation, many who had lived in rural villages with white households now moved to the cities where they could find work and a community with which to live. They soon established charitable organizations and churches that all stressed African roots. In the early 1780s, blacks in Newport formed the Free African Union Society as a self-help fraternity. And when they invited those in Providence to form an allied chapter, they addressed their invitation to all Africans in Providence. In 1796, members of Boston's African Society swore to watch over each other in their spiritual concerns, to live soberly, righteously, and godly in their present world. And 10 years later, that society could meet in the New African Meeting House, which they shared with the year-old African Baptist Church. As seen in the African Society's charter, they tended to require their members to conduct themselves in ways that mirrored emerging Anglo-American virtues of sobriety, punctuality, and industry. Many also sought to leave America and return to Africa. This is a movement that did indeed end in the 1810s, but for 2 decades, this effort was actually led by blacks themselves in New England. This meant that the children of mixed marriages who were active members of the black community also had to commit themselves publicly and privately to African organizations. Now, during the 1820s, community leaders increasingly stressed their people's intimate connection to American culture and history, including entrepreneurship and gender roles. By 1830, New England blacks celebrated Emancipation Day or Haitian Independence instead of their Negro election festivals, and rejected returning to Africa. Churches and schools became more important, and you can see in 1837, the African Baptist Church changed its name. You can see why. Beginning in 1830, annual meetings of the American Society of Free Persons of Color brought together delegates from African American communities in 11 states, forging a national network and identity that emphasized the virtues of prudence, frugality, and purity. Many leaders, such as Maria Stewart in Boston, preached patriarchal, market-oriented virtues. They urged their men to support and protect their women, who were to stay at home and become guardians of the family, even though, in fact, economic and social discrimination forced black women to work. Now, African Americans were not actually really trying to emulate Anglo-American virtues because they could not assume they would soon be accepted as equal members of New England society. Instead, the evolution of these standards should be seen as part of the process of forming a free but separate community, which could be as inclusive as possible, move closer to the dominant culture, and help black leaders form beneficial relations with Anglo-American elites. And that indeed happened in many states. These patriarchal, market-oriented values marked a deepening divide between African American and Indian communities. After the Revolution, Native groups remained closely connected to their rural ancestral lands, even as many men and women left for long periods to work in cities or on whaling ships. The mixed subsistence economy on tribal reserves, including hunting and cattle raising, fishing and farming, communal land holding and family allotments, and most notably the power of women to claim land, farm, and vote, formed the greatest surviving marker of Native culture at the turn of the century. Native craft traditions became more significant as Native, particularly women, marketed their baskets, mats, and other crafts throughout the region. These communities generally defended themselves and their reservations by reinforcing social and cultural boundaries in a way that emphasized birth, residence, and behavior. full members with rights to communal resources included the descendants of those already recognized as members of the tribe, those raised in any other Indian enclave, and individuals who demonstrated their support for their community. Strong barriers barred the sale of land and resources to outsiders, and traditions of witchcraft and hostility to selfishness remained strong, discouraging changes such as intensive farming. Surviving stories underscore how community standards continue to condemn acquisition and the values of capitalism. Probably the most distinctive markers of surviving Indian groups, however, was their communal land management and the role that women played as gatekeepers for their communities. Men who married into these communities were considered foreigners and strangers, and owned or gained access to community resources only through their wives. In all tribes except Narragansett, women could speak and vote in community meetings and sign petitions along with men. Thus, Indian women had political powers inside Native communities that they completely lacked outside of Native communities at this time. While African American leaders preached unstinting labor, frugality, stability, and individual improvement, distinctive Native work habits emphasized sharing and the support of kinship networks. Since 1800, most Indian men spent much of the year, if not several years, away on whaling voyages. Women formed the core of the community. They were in charge of fields and raised animals and crops for subsistence or local exchange. Now, of course, many natives could not accumulate capital themselves, in large part because they were locked in servitude, suffered from discrimination and poverty, and lived in rural subsistence economies. And Indians did not reject the marketplace. After all, they worked as mariners and laborers, sold timber and fish, and rented grazing land to white farmers, and were famous for making and peddling crafts. But Indian customs were clearly contrary to modern capitalism, as exemplified by Gayhead's sale of clay from its famous cliffs to manufacturers of ceramics. By the early 1820s, the tribe was selling at least 150 tons of clay a year, and divided the proceeds equally among all men and all women. Men were given twice as much as women were, who helped to dig and load the clay. And interestingly, through 1850, managed to keep their per-ton fees relatively consistent, despite the Great Depression of 1837, which really seems to show a certain disregard for the capitalist marketplace. Tribal communities also continued to be sustained by unique traditions and folklore. In part, this culture was maintained by churches led by Indian ministers who incorporated some ancient rituals with Christian beliefs and traditions. Although there was an interesting shift in some communities towards Baptist churches that brought in the English language and seemed to form a bridge with African Americans and poor whites at the same time. Not surprisingly, racial rhetoric continued or occasionally seemed to be wielded as a weapon in some Indian communities, exacerbated by the sharpening white prejudice that accompanied emancipation, which was discussed last night. In 1820, 19 Mohegans signed a petition which complained about the supposed corruption of their tribe from others. And they asked for a law from the state that would prevent this. 14 years later, when Rhode Island threatened for the first time apparently to eliminate the Narragansett separate legal status, the tribal council blamed their poor reputation on foreign Negroes who had married into the community. While such racist hyperbole was unusual and doubtless driven by the need to appeal to white sensibilities and prejudices, it does seem clear that the marriage of an Indian woman and an African American man represented a potential clash between the husband's culture, which emphasized patriarchy and individualism, and the wife's culture, which gave a woman and her community greater power. The tensions that could erupt within mixed families would have been even more intense when the Indian daughters of an African American man reached the age when they could vote in community meetings and claim pieces of communal land, rights to which the father was denied as a foreigner. Now, outside tribal reserves, there were many Indians who lived in what were now white villages and towns. And the children of these families, many of which were mixed, faced a wider range of social pressures. Many lived in African American neighborhoods, such as that in Worcester, and were seen by whites and blacks as part of that community, while at the same time they maintained kinship, social and cultural connections with descendants of their tribe. Some dropped out of these connections for years or even generations, but their children or grandchildren might decide to reclaim their native heritage and connections. There's nothing unusual about this. At the same time, the divide between Indians and African Americans should be seen not as a barrier, but a range of behaviors, kinship networks, and community definitions along a movable, malleable fence. This evolving ethnic boundary was far less rigid than the larger racial barrier created by Anglo-Americans between whites and people of color. The black communities, black mariners and laborers usually lived in distinct racially mixed neighborhoods, and the Jeremiads preached by Maria Stewart and others show that many African Americans did not conform to the emerging middle-class Anglo-American moral standards. And as I already noted, many Indians wanted to live closer to the American mainstream in many ways. Nor did Indian groups refuse to try new ways. Beginning in the 1820s, Mashpee, Christiantown, and Chappaquiddick established temperance societies, invigorated their schools, and adopted landholding and severalty. Yet the distance between Indian and Anglo-American communities and their values remained significant. Those allotments were sought after, in fact, primarily to defend community land against outsiders. Key resources were still held and managed in common. And women still played perhaps the most significant role in their communities. 1870, after the Civil War, as we reach mid-century, substantive Indian fears about African American foreigners may have actually grown as a sudden interest of many white American elites in civil and social equality offered blacks better opportunities outside Indian villages. And in various efforts to detribalize first Indians in Massachusetts and then in Rhode Island, you see this reflected in the hearings that were recorded by the state investigators. Between 1845 and 65, despite a remaining rigid racial ideology, blacks, with the assistance of white reformers, won a growing measure of civil equality. Railroads, school, and other public places were desegregated. And those who supported equal rights for blacks felt that individuals within Indian communities should be treated likewise under the law. And this is, in fact, one reason, perhaps the main reason, why states began to think about ending the separate legal status that Indian communities had. Now, after 1790, as I've shown, freedom, despite continued limitations, allowed black Americans to forge families, communities, institutions, and a better life. They made emerging Anglo-American concepts of property, virtuous labor, and gender roles significant goals to power and dignity. While intermarriage created kinship between people of African and Native descent, their growing divergence between African American and Indian concepts of property, identity, and gender roles made the gap even wider. While individuals continued to cross between groups and to forge connections that transcended such concerns, conflicts could and did occur even as both peoples of color faced prejudice and racism in the larger world. What we see here are two groups seeking to create or defend their communities. This isn't surprising. But what shaped their struggles and relations was that both communities had to create or reshape their social boundaries, their institutions, and their cultures within the dominant Anglo-American society. And that society tended to regard descendants of Africans or natives with a mixture of dislike, contempt, fear, and pity. Both Indian and black identities were shaped and reshaped by these external pressures as well as their own internal needs, situations, and traditions. I want to make it clear that I am not assigning individuals or families to one particular community or another. Native, black, and even white social boundaries overlapped, and people could cross between, or indeed even live within the interstices between groups. But I am trying to highlight the development of distinctive communities and think it important to affirm the creative construction of African American community and the creative and constructive effort of tribes to maintain and even rebuild themselves and their communities. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I guess maybe Ruth to come back if you want. Rather than read the very formal written comments to these papers I prepared, I just want to, put on the table, as it were, a couple questions to my colleagues here, and allow as much time as possible for interaction with this group, many of you who seem to have questions on your faces, as it were. So to begin in the order of presentation, I guess I'd ask Professor Newell if there is indeed a distinction between indenture and judicial slavery. I mean, I think there is. I'm not particularly persuaded that all indentures are in fact judicial slavery. And many of the finite indentures are not in any way distinct or different from the finite indentures of Europeans or Euro-Americans at the same time. And on the question of black codes, I really wonder if more what is happening in the period you're looking at is a racialization of servitude and an association of servitude and color, whatever the color or combination of color. I mean, this is from the perspective that in Massachusetts, slave is not a legal term, but in Massachusetts, the legal designation is servants for life. And it's for that reason that in 1783, slavery in Massachusetts is extinguished in the Walker versus Jennison cases and not abolished, because where in fact we have illegal slavery constructed in Rhode Island and Connecticut, there was no enabling legislation creating an institution known as slavery in Massachusetts. So slaves were always technically servants for life. So, I think these are just sort of general questions. And to Professor Herndon and Dr. Sikatal, I guess I would ask, are there some other possibilities for the relationship of Orson with the Thompsons? And I ask that question because an Anglo-Indian union is unusual in many ways. At least the literature tends to be silent about these. And could there be some other possibility? I mean, for example, could there be some relationship with Sosoa, or the former sachem? Could there be some relationship with Kitty or some other member of the family that doesn't necessarily indicate paternity? If indeed paternity is the case here, Orson's situation is really very unusual for a lot of reasons. So I'm just wondering, as we speculate, are there some other possibilities for that relationship to the Thompsons? And I guess, to the last presentation, I would ask Daniel, if indeed the defense of communal lands, which occurs among Native communities, is per se racially defined as opposed to being a general objection to an alienation and division of communal lands. And if the tension that you're identifying in terms of African Americans is the same tension for Euro-Americans who have married into tribal communities, that the issue, at least as I see it looking at some of the same source material, has to do with the maintenance of a communal land base, and that whether a Euro-American has married into the tribe or an African-American has married into the tribe, the concern of tribal people is to prevent any alienation of tribal resources, so that it's not a racial distinction per se. It just works out that with a majority of the tribal people you're looking at, the marriages across the color line have been marriages between African Americans and Native Americans. But where there are unions with Euro-Americans, I think there is the same tension and same conflict, because what's the central issue is tribal resources rather than racial categorization. But those are my questions, and I'd really like to open it up to the audience and encourage you to ask questions about these three presentations, or comments or reflections.
So I guess your questions first?
No, I'm just laying them on the table collegially. I think we might want to deal with some of the questions from the floor first. Or is that not acceptable? Wait a minute. My colleagues here are...
I'd actually like to...
Okay.
Wow, that's heavy.
Okay. However we want to do this.
I actually wanted to address the question, because it gives me a chance to correct something that an impression I obviously gave. Indeed, foreigners and strangers were Anglo-Americans who married in as well as blacks, and there's no question. In fact, there's one petition. I'm racking my brain right now, and I can't remember it. Where I believe it was from Mashpee, where they wanted to include blacks who married in as members of the community. They wanted to be able to offer blacks who married in rights to land, but not to whites who married in. That's the one petition I've seen that clearly shows that. The trend, though, seemed to be that whites who married in or blacks who married in were foreigners or strangers, and therefore the community lands had to be defended against the possibility that they would hurt the community.
I can easily answer relative to Sasaw and O'Hitty and Austin. If they were sticking to the traditional way, the women were in charge of the land and the men were there to protect it. So therefore, the reason why Austin was buried in the Indian cemetery was because of his mother's relationship probably to Sasaw.
I think your point's well taken, Tom. I didn't mean to suggest that all indentured servants or all Indians who found themselves under indenture were necessarily involuntarily engaging in these contracts. Not all indentures were equal. There are many cases of adult Indians who are signing indentures for limited periods of time, almost labor contracts for a year or two. And occasionally, you do have Native American parents placing their children under indenture to white masters, but there's some of the force of law behind that, behind those sorts of actions, and also often debt or other sorts of financial relationships between often you have families who are in debt who are indenturing their children as a way of getting out of debt. The next resort being for the parents to indenture themselves and then take away the family's livelihood. So you have these, I think in the 18th century, these Native Americans who don't necessarily have access to tribal lands and resources, or even some of those that do, are just suffering terrible financial pressures because a lot of their traditional hunting grounds are closed off to them. Some of their traditional ways of making a livelihood have been closed off to them. They are in much smaller territories than they had been before, and the interactions with whites are more liable to more liable to result in relations of debt or accusations of trespass. You have a lot of families who, because one of the adults in the family gets sick and dies, and medical costs, the cost of care of that person, burial costs for the person, will put a family into a position where they're indenturing their children as a way of paying off that particular kind of debt. And also, Ruth and Ella have worked on this subject as well, but especially in the 18th century, we see the indentures involving Native Americans are often very different from the indentures involving whites, that they often don't specify what the white master's obligations are, which is a traditional element of an indenture. This is what the servant's obligations are, but this is also what the master's obligations are. They're often not being required to provide education or training for Native American children as they would for a white child, or the traditional apparel or freedom dues, what you get at the other end. There's often not specificity about that. And as I said, I think a lot of times these children, if they don't have good protectors, if a parent's not on hand involved in the crafting of this indenture, justices of the peace had the right, at least if there were two justices, they could indenture Indian children. They could sign the indentures for Native Americans. If there's not a Native American adult or someone with a real stake in this situation there to protect the individual entering into the indenture, there was lots of room for abuse. And a lot of these JPs themselves were dealing in Indian servants. They were buying and selling them. And again, especially if you're a minor and you enter in these, if you were involved in that kind of indenture, these are the people I find sort of entering in a slippery slope towards de facto enslavement. They essentially end up being treated as slaves, being held all their lives with maybe brief periods of freedom in that experience. And I think you're absolutely right about what's going on with this race frontier. It is a racialization of servitude. That being a servant is becoming associated with being black. So that even people who are trying to insist on their Native American identity, if they are servants, their assumptions are that they must be black, or this is why you see these terms of musty mulatto being applied to these people as well. So you have instances where Native Americans are fighting these designations just because it can also lead towards a blurring of one's status to the status of enslavement.
As far as the serving, this is one of the areas where the indenture or the slavery, that's what I call it, was effective, and where the people were conditioned to caring. They took care of the ill. Whenever any of the communicable diseases were around, they would send Indians even to take care of the Caucasians that were there. This is something that has carried forth into even the 20th century, where the women were midwives and also nurses and were interested in getting degrees in nursing and weren't just satisfied with being a nurse's aide. And relative to the teaching aspect, that's one of the things that's very important in the Indian communities of today. That is a carryover from what happened in the 18th century, where it is necessary to teach.
I'd like to open this up to the floor. As I said, there seem to be lots of questions written on people's faces. Begin right here.
I have a question just about sort of the persistence of Indian slavery in the 18th century in New England. You mentioned, Margaret, especially the shift towards judicial enslavement, which I think you've done a great job of describing. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about the other forms of Indian slavery that persist, importation from the Carolinas, and then also in areas like the Connecticut River Valley, Springfield, where fur trade and native alliances remain more important and persistent. Do you see a greater concentration of sort of non-judicial enslavement coming through those areas, or is it?
There's only I've only been able to track specifically a handful of people being enslaved as war captives in the 18th century, in part because it causes such bad feeling that because of the need of the New England governments for Indian reserves in their constant chronic wars with the French during this period. There's a lot of chat about this, actually, a lot of discussion of that this is really causing problems with our allies and with potential allies, and it also made it more difficult for English settlers to redeem their own captives among the Indians. It sets up the situation where, they're going to take white captives, and then we're involved in sort of complicated exchanges. We're encouraging them to take more. This is setting us up to get have more white captives taken. There are still some people who are being, though, taken as slaves from Canada, from the northeast, but it tends to be much more scattered. It's nothing like these wholesale situations that you see in the end of the Pequot War, King Philip's War, where they're literally auctioning. They're page after page of notices in Treasurer John Hull's accounts, He was the treasurer of Massachusetts during King Philip's War, page after page, where they're just auctioning off all of these people, many of whom were really just women and children who were caught between war lines. So you have a more, some individuals in the 18th century, but nothing. I haven't found yet the wholesale thing. And the British are putting a lot of pressure on New England to stop this practice. And this is especially true during the Dominion of New England and after Massachusetts loses its charter, gets a royal governor. That the British are saying you've got to stop this as well because it's complicating our attempts to build alliances with Native Americans in Iroquois and in Canada. So they're getting pressure from a number of imperial concerns, essentially, in addition to their own ideas about what it meant for these Southern New Englanders to be subjects.
But it didn't move even into the 20th century, where they would take the children of Indian families whom the states and local governments would declare as unfit parents, and they would take the kids and place them with non-Indian families.
For here? Sorry.
I wanted to ask a question of Margaret Newell. Could you talk a bit about the slippage that occurred among the war captives who would slip away and be protected and absorbed by Native peoples, even of different clans, in other words, who escaped slavery that way?
Sure. I mean, there's certainly the Native American groups in the region do make efforts to repatriate relatives, petition on behalf of relatives, protect runaways. Although the New England colonies, the United Colonies, put a lot of pressure on nearby tribes to return captives. If masters are constantly sort of saying, I want my captive returned, or I want my Indian slave or servant returned. And it's part of the diplomatic exchanges with these various tribes to return the captives. And in fact, in the 17th century, the Narragansetts, other tribes end up having to, as part of these agreements foisted upon the tribes by the United Colonies, there are fugitive slave clauses, essentially, saying if you don't return captives, you yourself are subject to being enslaved or subject to high penalties. Certainly, people did run away. They resisted enslavement and servitude in lots of ways. And also, people did leave at times. Would go away, come back. This is what slavery was like in 17th and 18th century Georgia, other places. African slavery. I mean, it's not a total system necessarily. I mean, there's room for resistance. There's room for coming and going. But I haven't found a lot of cases of people who. This was the presupposition that Indians wouldn't make good slaves because it was too easy for them to run away and melt into the nearby tribes. I don't think that's really true. I don't think that's going on all that much. You do have people returning to their own families and their own kin, but I haven't found a lot of examples. Maybe you can tell me about some after the talk, but I haven't found a lot of examples of people fleeing to other tribes and finding protection there.
And it's also difficult for the Carolinians, who are marvelously tattooed and different hairstyle and stand out, even when compared with the Aboriginal people of New England.
Right. Well, that was also the other part of Brett's question. I did mention in my talk that in the same period where the New England colonies are protecting their local Native Americans from slavery, at least officially, there's a huge bump up in the importation of Indians from other regions, from Carolinas, from Spanish Florida. There's always some Caribbean Indians coming through, and also from Canada. So in fact, if you look at newspapers during the period, there are as many advertisements for these so-called Spanish Indians or Carolina Indians as there are for African slaves in the 1680s, 90s, early 1700s, up through you still see them in the 1720s. Now, in the 17-teens, most of the New England colonies, though, start regulating this trade, try to prohibit keeping Carolina or Spanish Indians in New England, mandate the re-export because they're considered to be possibly more liable to revolt. They're considered to be less acculturated than Southern New England Indians, more potentially dangerous. They're subject to the same sorts of taxes that African slaves are, and these people are chattel slaves. Their mothers and children are being sold together. They're being referred to as slaves. My sense is that these people are slaves.
There's one in the back row. Is there not a question from back there?
Oh, I got my hand up briefly.
Okay.
About the Tuscaroran Indians, 1715, they were specifically banned from entering Connecticut. Connecticut didn't want anything to do with it.
You know, but you have these bans and people get around them. You know, it's.
Well, it was also a period of time when African imports into Connecticut were increasing dramatically. It was really a flag for the conversion in Connecticut anyway.
To African slavery.
In southern New England over to really the exclusive use of the enslaved Africans
Sure.
rather than native.
Right, but you know, I see a lot of.
Banned, and I think in Connecticut.
And in
Maybe-
Massachusetts.
Specific
okay.
law
Yeah.
written about that, and
But-
they were effectively excluded from the colony.
Well, they're banned in Rhode Island and Massachusetts too, but people are petitioning to keep them. You see lots of individual petitions. It's going to be hardship if I have to get rid of my Carolina Indian, and you still see people with those sorts of references.
They didn't have any to get rid of because they
They didn't actually.
Yeah.
Well, and I mean, that also, you know, it relates to the imperial struggles that Margaret had referenced. I mean, the Board of Trade and Plantations in 1715-16 is being told these terrible conflicts in the Carolinas are because of the exploitation of these people as slaves. And Cotton Mather, again, you mentioned Cotton Mather this morning, has a lovely letter to one of his friends in Edinburgh where he talks about the just ire of these Carolina Indians, and he used a phrase which I'd not seen anywhere else in the 18th century, that they barbecued one of the slave traders down in the Carolinas. So this whole question of the relationship between the Yamasee Wars and other conflicts in the South and the exportation of alleged Carolina Indians is very much part of the political and imperial discourse of the decade. Over here?
I'd like to still explore a little bit indenture and slavery because of a dialogue that I had a while ago with my colleague Betty Little, who is no longer with us. When I started writing about African and Indian slavery in Nantucket, and Betty responded to my draft with an impassioned letter about indentures, basically denying there was any slavery in Nantucket. And I said, well, you know, the Africans didn't come here. There's not anybody who ever woke up in Africa one morning and said, I'm going to go and work for a family in Nantucket. And they were listed in inventories and probate, generally with the domestic animals. But I was more open to the question of Indians. And the point I shoved at Betty, but I still am not entirely confident of it, is a Nantucket woman who in her testament left a quilt, a necklace, and, quote, my Indian girl to a good friend. Now, if a human being can be left in a will, does that imply this is something other than an indenture? Or is it the passing on of an indenture to another person?
Well, usually they should mention the time left on the indenture. If it had gone through probate and they were valuing all these assets and talked about what the value was, they would often for white servants they would say 7 years remaining.
There wasn't an inventory. It was just
Oh, it's the will itself. Yeah, I mean, this is kind of one of the difficult questions I face in my own research. How can I categorize a person like that? To me, if they don't mention how much time, if they're saying my Indian girl, sometimes they will also have a tagline for the rest of their natural life, for the rest of her natural life. But they'll say time remaining. I mean, these people, even in writing wills, people are often very specific. So they'll say time remaining, 7 years, et cetera. So that's a little bit of an ambiguous case, but I'd be more inclined to say that's a servant for life. That's a person who's sliding over to the slave category on the spectrum, in my opinion.
We have quite a number of deeds of manumission from Nantucket because early in the 1700s, a large portion of Nantucket accepted a revelation against lifelong involuntary servitude. And so members of the Society of Friends were urged to manumit their slaves. Our last deed of manumission is very late. It's after the famous Prince Boston case. Mm-hmm. It's almost at the point where Massachusetts announces the extinction of slavery. And it's a Quaker. And in his deed of manumission, he does not use the word servant that you find sort of euphemistically or perhaps legalistically in early ones. He outright calls them slaves and manumits them at last. I have been thinking of the servant in the earlier deeds of manumission as a euphemism, but if I understand it, then it actually is a legalism.
Well, I would argue that it's a legalism. I know there's another panel on law which might disagree, but my position is that, at least in Massachusetts, slaves have a persona. They have a personhood, and one has access to their labor, not necessarily their bodies or their souls, but one has access to the lifetime labor. Now, perhaps the next panel would disagree, but that's a different topic. Could I have a question from the floor on something other than slavery?
I just wanted to ask Ruth and Ellen to talk a little more about the really interesting case here and how you're going to develop it more. We have more than 20 minutes or so. And I'm just really interested in the elaborate terms of the indenture. Are there other indentures from this period, particularly with young unmarried Indian males, that are similar? Would you say this is quite unique? Sort of what directions would you go besides the
This indenture is totally unique. I've never seen anything like it. We have examined thousands of indentures, particularly of children who are bound out. And we have hundreds of kids who are specifically identified as Indian. So we have a good base to compare it with, and I've never seen anything like it. For one thing, it's an adult who is being bound as though he were an underage child. The terms of the indenture are very similar to what would be in a typical pauper apprenticeship of a child. But I've never seen anything that indentures somebody for 70 years. I've never seen anything that indentures somebody for more than 10 years, actually. Maybe you have, Margaret.
I have. I mean, I've seen these, especially in these judicial enslavements that I'm talking about, or court-ordered indentures of 35 years, of terms like that, which are essentially life sentences for adults. So.
But a non-judicial indenture, where this one purports to be the voluntary decision of the person being indented.
No, I haven't seen that one.
It stands out in the record as a document. It's put into the Westerly Town records like no other indentures are. It was very clearly unique in their experience, and they surrounded it with legal language and said, yes, they being the justices of the peace for Westerly, and saying, yes, we approve this, this is legitimate. An underlying question is who's benefiting from this arrangement. It's a lifelong job, if you want to look at it that way. It's also lifelong maintenance. So is this ultimately to Orson's benefit, or is it ultimately to the master's benefit? Aside from the biological question, perhaps there is a debt of honor contracted between the two men, and this was a way of paying it. There's very little detail about the lives of Orson and Elias Thompson that can give us, the indenture is the best evidence itself of what's going on. But the fact that it stands out in all the hundreds and, in fact, thousands of indentures as being unusual in providing pay, in providing certain liberties, in length of time, and in this murky relationship of Orson being treated kindly and wanting, in a sense, to be protected according to the language of the indenture. It's all very mysterious, and we're quite open to more information about it. Maybe you could do something with it.
Okay, another question? Daniel's waiting for a question, I know. No? Okay.
I have a question maybe that would bring this discussion that we're having sort of more to the present day. I'm wondering if any of the panelists would be able to comment on how discussions or distinctions of ethnicity in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century have carried over into federal recognition petitions for the Native American groups feeling like.
Oh, yes. Just the term Native Americans. How many people here were born in the United States? Are you not all Native Americans? So it's terminology that we have had to deal with in the stereotypical genocidal practices of the Euro-Americans. So, anybody else have that?
Well, I would say that you have a panel that's getting along famously. Do you want us to start disagreeing all at once on this topic? I don't know, but folks may want to respond.
Let me frame it or add to the frame. Have any of the panelists had occasion to be called as expert witnesses in legal proceedings revolving around tribal membership, tribal land ownership?
Yes.
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 I've been asked but haven't done it.
How many raise the hand if you have not been involved? So from that vantage point, go ahead and comment.
Well, I was just asked to comment simply on the BIA's initial draft finding on one of the Nipmuc groups that had applied for federal recognition. And I was just asked to look at the historical discussion in the document, not on questions of genealogy, which is really where they get into the question that involves descent and what could be called race. So I don't know whether that counts or not.
Well, I'm the expert in a pending matter at the moment. I don't want to say too much about that, but I think, I'm someone who in my work argues that ethnicity and pigmentation are obviously not the same thing, and that 17th century New Englanders are not necessarily more enlightened about that topic than 20th century New Englanders. And obviously, what is inscribed in records of the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, has profound consequences for how people's federal recognition efforts are managed at this time, since part of the BIA requirement deals with identification by historians, anthropologists, and other experts in the field. Then all of this alleged expertise comes back to haunt people in ways that are not helpful to people's petition efforts. Here, I'm sorry, someone left before he could get his question in. Do you know what it was?
No.
Okay.
I know who it was.
Okay.
I just had a question for Dr. Sikatow. I'm wondering if you could speak a little more about the sharing of the Narragansett oral tradition.
The sharing of it?
Yeah.
There are those of us who are willing to sit and share as much as we can for as long as people have questions to ask, if we know the answers. And what we will usually do is to try to direct them to what was said and misinterpreted over the centuries because of our knowledge of traditional, to help the people explain. There's one thing that has really been bothering me since we first started in, and that was when cannibalism was discussed this morning, and the purposes of cannibalism. It is true that it prevailed in different levels. And when the Mohawks got into their cannibalism, it was because of the courageous presentation of the person that they killed. So if this person had extraordinary running ability and endurance, they might eat part of the leg. If this person was strong of heart, they were going to take the heart out and eat that, because it was felt that the spirit or part of the spirit of that person could come to you. That's how the cannibalism was amongst the Mohawks. How do I know? I had an ancient Mohawk relative.
Yeah, on that score, I think that some of you may be familiar with the single source of human flesh eating in New England during the, well, if we can believe the Anglo writers, during the Pequot War, when a captive Pequot is killed and he is eaten, so the English tell us. We have another strange mention, which is only from one 19th century source, so I'm not sure where the information comes from, that allegedly part of Metacomet's shoulder is taken off and eaten by natives. But those are the only two examples I know of cannibalism outside of an alleged fantastic case which occurs in Natick in 1733. But I'm not going to say too much about that since I'm presenting a conference paper on that next month.
This happened in a long time ago. Block Island had two parts to it before the storms put in enough sand and one thing and another, so it became one island on a little part that we called Deer Island. And that is where we sent our people who were mentally deranged because of trauma and bad experience in their life. And there was cases of cannibalism that existed for those people to survive. And along with the animal bones and fish bones and bird bones, etc., in the what was dug out by archaeologists, they came across the parts of human remains and the bones. And then it was time to tell them, yes, we knew about this, because that was the area where we Narragansett sent our mentally unbalanced people.
To the floor.
What instructions were given to federal census takers in 1790 relative to the exclusion of Native Americans from the count, even if they were in the household as indentured servants?
Yeah, I don't know. The 1790 census had three categories. It had white and then various female, male, Asian, slave, and other people. And I actually just happened to be going over it the other day, the 1790 census, and I did notice that in, I don't know which town it was, there were, it may have been Charlestown, actually, there was a large number of non-slave people of color, which made me think that those are probably Narragansetts who were being counted at that point by the census taker, and yet there were other towns where they clearly weren't. I don't think Mashpee, for example, even appears in the 1790 census, as I recall. So it was kind of very informal, up to the census taker, and therefore, to some extent, shaped by the prejudices or outlook of a particular individual.
And the natives aren't supposed to be enumerated, so that's...
Indians not taxed.
Indians not taxed, precisely. So. Anyone else want to talk to the question? No? Okay. This one here.
Thank you. Professor Neal, I wanted to ask you a question. I really just enjoyed your presentation so much, and I was struck sort of by your focus and wondering if you might be willing to talk a little bit more about whether or not there was any Native American involvement in Indian slavery. You know, I study South Carolina, so there's just rampant involvement for a lot of different reasons. And I was wondering if you'd be willing to talk about that and perhaps their motivations or reasons for doing so, if that occurs.
Could you repeat the question? She was asking if there was Native American involvement in Indian slavery, and the short answer is yes. In the 17th century, both in the Pequot War and in King Philip's War, it was sometimes Indian captors who were bringing the captives to the English, or Indian Indian allies of English forces who were involved in some of this captive exchange. And in fact, Uncas, who's creating a tribal identity for the Mohegans in the sort of essentially creating a tribe. He uses Pequot captives in some ways as the base of his Mohegan tribe. But in the context of what happens to the Pequots during the Pequot War, the Narragansett Indians have a dialogue with United Colonies authorities. And the Narragansetts, their opinions are forwarded by Roger Williams. The Narragansett's position is, well, we don't really mind if some of the chief leaders of the Pequots are enslaved and perhaps sent to England, sent abroad, but the way that the majority of the slaves were being deployed was of some concern to them. They said, it's more of the custom that such people would live among us and have houses and farms. So in other words, this notion of more of assimilation of captives, and not necessarily that they have such a distinct status. Although there's some evidence that some of these groups had been, that there were people people of more liminal status before European contact. Captives from other tribes, for example, that might not have full status, might not have full access to resources, might be doing other sorts of work. But it does seem clear that Native Americans defined what was going on with these captives a little differently. They were concerned with exportation of captives, concerned with people being brought out of their home region. And we see the similar sorts of activities in the context of King Philip's War. But because in the 18th century they're just not playing that kind of role, because we're not seeing so many people, so many slaves who are war captives. And even in the context of the 17th century, it's not, in New England I don't see this sort of massive slave trade or wars being waged to get captives, to get involved in the trade, except on the part of the English, who actually talk about going to war in 1645 to get captives as a kind of motivation. So there's that kind of discussion, but not the kind of major role in the 17th century.
Do you want to say something about indenture? Because, for example, I find instances of Indians with other indentured Indians in the 18th century. Mm-hmm. Good example is the Ninigret's family, which is a real classic example, or families on Cape Cod. But my experience seems to indicate that a majority of the Indians who have other indentured Indians are in fact very high status Indians. But I don't know, what is your research on?
No, I'd agree with that. I found those sorts of examples kind of few and far between. Not terribly. They have African slaves.
Slaves as
mm-hmm.
well as other Indian slaves.
Sure.
Look at the census of the late 18th and into the early 19th mm-hmm. century. It says the household, mm-hmm. 10 Indians and 2 or 3 others in many cases.
To the floor again? No? Okay, well, in that case, I'd like to, thank our panel. This has been a really good series of presentations, and I'm glad we've had this time to dialogue. So thank you very much.